Imagine a 7-year-old boy standing barefoot on the damp timber of a southern textile mill in the dead of winter. The air around him is thick with airborne cotton dust, choked so dense that a lantern hanging 6 feet away is reduced to a dull, sickly orange blur. All around him, massive cast-iron power looms crash back and forth with terrifying violence, their steel shuttles flying at 40 miles an hour. When a thread snaps deep inside the whirring heart of the machine, it is this 7-year-old who must plunge his bare hands directly into the churning gears to tie a knot before the shift supervisor notices a delay. His hands are covered in black grease and dried blood. His lungs are already scarred by chronic disease, and at the end of a grueling 14-hour shift that began before sunrise, his total compensation for the day is 12 cents. There is no safety inspector coming to shut the factory down. There is no wage board to enforce a floor on his earnings. There is no law preventing his employer from cutting those 12 cents in half tomorrow or replacing him with a 5-year-old who will work for 6. Think about this for a moment. Right now, every single hour you work in the United States is governed by an invisible bedrock assumption that there is a legally mandated baseline beneath which your time cannot be valued. We take it for granted as an immovable pillar of modern economic life. But for the first 162 years of American history, that baseline simply did not exist. Employers could and did pay whatever they pleased, including absolute zero for prison laborers and desperate families working in coal towns. Millions of children were funneled into mines, slaughterhouses, and industrial canneries, working until their bones warped, traded like cheap disposable machine parts in a completely unregulated free market. So how did the nation survive for more than a century and a half in this state of absolute industrial exploitation? The answer is not a peaceful story of benevolent politicians granting rights to the working class out of moral duty. The textbook narrative claims that the federal minimum wage was a natural milestone of progressive Enlightenment reform, a gift bestowed upon a grateful public by forward-thinking leaders. The hidden reality is far darker and far more calculated. It took over 30 years of bitter labor wars, hundreds of worker deaths, supreme judicial obstruction on behalf of elite private interests, and the worst economic collapse in human history to force a legal flaw into existence. And when that law was finally drafted in the dark corridors of power, it was deliberately engineered with an insidious racial loophole designed to leave millions of the most vulnerable workers entirely unprotected. To understand how this invisible cage was constructed and who built the machinery of control, we have to go back to the smoking industrial centers of turn-of-the-century America, where a silent crisis was rapidly reaching its breaking point. By the turn of the 20th century, this completely unregulated industrial machine was consuming human life at a rate unprecedented in human history. The United States was undergoing the fastest, most brutal economic transformation the modern world had ever seen, driven by coal, steel, and textiles. But beneath the glittering wealth of the Gilded Age lay a horrifying reality that was rapidly pushing the nation toward total social collapse. To understand the sheer scale of the crisis, you have to look at the numbers. By the year 1900, census records estimated that over 2 million children under the age of 16 were fully integrated into the American workforce. In the textile mills of the American South, children as young as 5 years old were working shifts that stretched from 12 to 14 hours a day. In the coal breakers of Pennsylvania, young boys spent 10 hours a day crouched over wooden chutes, hands sorting razor-sharp slate from falling coal, their fingers permanently scarred, swollen, and worn down to the bone. The human cost was catastrophic. The standard American workweek across almost every major industry averaged between 60 and 70 hours, often stretching even higher during peak production cycles. There were no federal safety standards, no mandatory break periods, no overtime pay, and no minimum wage. If a worker was injured by an unguarded gear or crushed in a cave-in, they were immediately thrown onto the street and replaced within the hour. In the industrial heartlands, entire working-class families lived in grinding poverty despite every single member, from grandmothers to toddlers, working full-time shifts. Public outrage began to boil over as the human toll became impossible to ignore. Investigative journalists, labor organizers, and social reformers began documenting the carnage. One man in particular, a former sociology professor turned investigative photographer named Louis Hine, embarked on a dangerous journey across the country carrying a heavy glass plate camera disguised as an industrial inspector. Hine risked physical violence from factory guards and corporate hired guns to capture raw, unvarnished images of children working in dark mills, dangerous glass factories, and toxic canneries. Hine's photographs, published in newspapers and pamphlets across the nation, shocked the public conscience. Images of barefoot boys hanging off massive spinning frames and young girls with sunken, hollow eyes forced average Americans to confront the brutal reality of the products they consumed every day. A massive wave of public demand for reform swept the nation. Citizens demanded an immediate end to child labor and the establishment of a fair wage floor that would allow a working family to survive without sacrificing their children to the machines. State legislatures across the country felt the immense political pressure and began to act. Between 1912 and 1923, more than a dozen states, led by Massachusetts, passed localized minimum wage laws and restricted child labor hours. It seemed for a brief moment that the sheer force of public outcry was about to dismantle the unregulated exploitation of the industrial era. But there was a structural flaw in the American legal architecture, a hidden mechanism of corporate control that rendered these popular reforms entirely useless. The state laws were local, but the corporations operating inside them were national, and they possessed a legal weapon that could systematically obliterate any attempt at government regulation. Whenever a state passed a law establishing a wage floor or prohibiting child labor, industrial lobbies immediately filed federal lawsuits. They argued that any government interference in the wage contract violated the United States Constitution. And when those cases reached the nation's highest court, the public reform movement hit an insurmountable brick wall. In landmark decision after landmark decision, the Supreme Court struck down state and federal labor regulations, establishing a legal doctrine known as liberty of contract. Under this doctrine, the court claimed that the Constitution protected an absolute, unfettered right of an individual to contract their labor on whatever terms they chose. In practice, this meant a starving, desperate worker had the theoretical freedom to contract their labor for 5 cents an hour, and any law trying to stop an employer from offering that wage was ruled unconstitutional. Remember this legal doctrine, because the exact same concept of liberty of contract would return decades later under a completely different name to strip modern workers of their rights. By the 1920s, the system was completely frozen. State laws were struck down, federal child labor acts were declared unconstitutional, and corporate profits soared while real wages stagnated. The government appeared entirely powerless to protect its own citizens from industrial exploitation. The traditional political process had completely failed, and into that massive power vacuum stepped someone the American public had never elected, a figure who understood that if you want to rewrite the rules of a nation, you do not fight the system from the outside. You have to build the machinery from within. The government was powerless, paralyzed by a conservative judiciary that enforced corporate supremacy under the guise of constitutional freedom. But into that vacuum stepped someone the public had never elected, a figure who understood that if you want to rewrite the rules of a nation, you do not fight the system from the outside. You have to build the machinery from within. Her name was Frances Perkins. Born in Boston in 1880, she was an intellectual prodigy with a fiery moral intensity, educated at Mount Holyoke and Columbia University. But Perkins was not an ivory tower academic. She was a woman driven by a terrifying vision she had witnessed firsthand. On a crisp spring afternoon in March 1911, Perkins was having tea near Washington Square in New York City when screams echoed from the street below. She ran outside just in time to watch 94 young immigrant women jump to their deaths from the upper floors of the burning Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, their clothing ablaze, hitting the concrete below because the factory owners had locked the exit doors to prevent worker theft. That horrifying sight transformed Perkins forever. She dedicated her life to mastering the bureaucratic machinery of labor reform. Unlike the corporate lobbies or the traditional politicians, Perkins understood the cold, dry mechanics of administrative law better than anyone in America. She was brilliant, razor-sharp, fiercely disciplined, and she possessed a singular tactical instinct for navigating the swamp of state and national politics. She wore dark, conservative clothes, held herself with austere dignity, and operated inside political circles dominated exclusively by men, systematically earning their respect through sheer intellectual dominance. By 1933, the nation was drowning in the industrial nightmare of the Great Depression. Millions of men were out of work, shanty towns spanned the country, and the economic order was on the verge of total collapse. Newly elected President Franklin Delano Roosevelt called Perkins to his private townhouse in New York. He wanted her to serve as his Secretary of Labor, the first woman ever nominated to a presidential cabinet in United States history. Perkins did not humbly accept the offer. Instead, she laid out a written ultimatum. She told FDR that she would only accept the cabinet post if he agreed to support her radical, unyielding agenda: a mandatory federal minimum wage, a legal ceiling on working hours, an end to child labor, federal unemployment insurance, and old age pensions. Roosevelt looked at the blueprint, recognized the desperate state of the country, and agreed. Now pause and think about the unique nature of this historical moment. In standard political narratives, reform is driven by heroic politicians fighting off evil corporate barons. But as labor historians like Kirsten Downey have meticulously documented, Frances Perkins operated as a relentless architect working from inside the deep administrative apparatus of the state. She was fighting on behalf of the public, yes, but her methods were purely tactical, bureaucratic, and calculated. Her primary opponents were not just the industrial trusts and corporate lobbies, but the Supreme Court of the United States itself. For 3 decades, the High Court had functioned as the ultimate legal guardian of unchecked capitalism, striking down every meaningful labor law passed by Congress or the states. The justices who anchored this conservative bloc were guided by doctrines that prioritized property rights and corporate autonomy over human life. They were the true villain architects of the era, erecting a legal fortress around industrial exploitation that seemed entirely unassailable. Perkins knew that if she simply drafted a standard minimum wage law, the Supreme Court would tear it to pieces within months, just as they had done to the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1935. She needed a strategy that could bypass judicial sabotage, navigate a deeply divided Congress, and overcome the fierce resistance of Southern industrialists who relied on hyper-cheap labor to maintain their regional monopolies. She began working in secret, gathering a small cadre of brilliant young lawyers in low-lit offices inside the Department of Labor. They pored over old court records, searching for hidden constitutional loopholes, drafting and redrafting statutory language beneath the dim glow of desk lamps. They were constructing a master key, a legislative device that could survive the legal gauntlet of the Supreme Court while establishing a permanent wage floor for the American worker. The task was monumental. Perkins had to balance the fierce demands of union leaders who feared a minimum wage would lower overall pay scales, the desperate needs of millions of impoverished citizens, and the cutthroat opposition of Southern Democrats who refused to sign any bill that altered the racial and economic hierarchy of their states. Hold that picture in your mind. A brilliant woman quietly orchestrating the restructuring of the American economy from an obscure office in Washington, because it is the foundation of everything that comes next. They had the plan, they had the power. Now they needed to make it real, without the legal machinery of the corporate elite tearing it to pieces before it could take effect. Sociologists and historians of public policy highlight that the establishment of centralized bureaucratic systems was often birthed out of a desire to manage urban chaos and industrial complexity. As populations expanded, administrative state institutions sought standardized metrics to organize modern society. While these mechanisms inevitably created oppressive tools of social control and inequality, their original architects frequently defended them as essential advancements in administrative efficiency and public order. By the early spring of 1937, the Great Depression was in its eighth agonizing year, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew his entire New Deal was hanging by a thread. The Supreme Court had spent 4 years ruthlessly dismantling his program, striking down federal agencies and state labor laws with clinical precision. If the administration wanted to build a permanent, legal wage floor under the American economy, they could not fight the corporate lobby and the judiciary head-on. They had to construct a piece of legislation so airtight, so cleverly structured under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, that even the most reactionary Supreme Court justices could not strike it down without dismantling the basic federal power to regulate interstate trade. Working deep inside the Department of Labor, Frances Perkins and her team of young legal strategists began assembling the draft of what would become the Fair Labor Standards Act. The strategy was pure stealth. To overcome the old liberty of contract doctrine, they did not frame the bill as a humanitarian rescue of the poor, which the courts had already ruled unconstitutional. Instead, they framed it strictly as a regulation of interstate commerce. The bill proposed that any goods produced by workers paid less than a basic statutory minimum, or worked beyond a capped threshold of hours, or produced by child labor under the age of 16, would be legally barred from crossing state lines. It was a Trojan horse. Under the guise of regulating commercial transport, the federal government was quietly claiming the power to dictate working conditions inside every factory, mine, and mill across the United States. In May 1937, Roosevelt sent the bill to Capitol Hill, confident that the sheer weight of the economic crisis would force it through Congress. But he had fundamentally underestimated the entrenched power of Southern industrialists and the reactionary faction of his own Democratic Party. Southern congressmen, controlled by textile barons, timber magnates, and agricultural elites, saw the federal minimum wage as a direct existential threat to their entire regional business model. The South's competitive advantage rested on a bedrock of hyper-cheap, non-unionized labor. More importantly, it rested on a rigid racial caste system. In the 1930s South, black workers were paid far less than white workers for the same brutal labor, maintaining a social and economic order that had persisted since Reconstruction. A uniform federal minimum wage would shatter that wage differential and grant black workers economic leverage they had never possessed. For over a year, Southern Democrats teamed up with conservative Northern Republicans to paralyze the bill. They bottled it up in the House Rules Committee, refusing to let it reach the floor for a vote. They launched furious floor debates, arguing that a national wage standard was Soviet-style central planning that would destroy the Southern economy. When reformers pointed out that children were still working 14-hour days in Southern cotton mills, corporate lobbyists countered with the familiar, century-old refrain that the government was violating the sacred liberty of contract and stripping poor families of their freedom to earn a living. Then, in late 1937, the strategy faced a sudden and shocking breakthrough from an unexpected quarter. The Supreme Court, terrified by Roosevelt's aggressive threat to pack the court with new justices, suddenly pivoted in a landmark case known as West Coast Hotel Company v. Parrish. In a sharp 5-4 decision, the court abandoned 30 years of precedent, explicitly discarding the liberty of contract doctrine and upholding a state minimum wage law for women. The legal fortress built by industry interests had finally cracked wide open. With the judicial obstruction shattered, Perkins and Roosevelt applied crushing political pressure on Congress. Over 200 representatives signed a discharge petition to force the bill out of committee and onto the House floor. The corporate lobby realized they could no longer kill the bill entirely, so they switched tactics. If they could not defeat the minimum wage, they would gut it from the inside. Here is the detail that quietly breaks the official textbook story in half. To secure the votes of Southern Democrats needed to pass the law, Roosevelt and Perkins were forced to make a devastating, calculated compromise. Southern politicians made their terms crystal clear. They would not support any bill that covered agricultural labor or domestic service. These were the two dominant occupations of Black and Hispanic Americans across the American South and West. Sit with that reality for a moment. The Roosevelt administration did not fight this exclusion to the end. They accepted it. When the Fair Labor Standards Act was finally signed into law on June 25, 1938, establishing the nation's first federal minimum wage at 25 cents an hour and a maximum work week of 44 hours, it explicitly excluded farm workers, domestic servants, seasonal laborers, and tip-based service workers. At a single stroke of a pen over miles of paper, millions of the most exploited workers in the nation, more than two-thirds of all black workers in the American South, were deliberately stripped of federal protection. The official historical narrative celebrates June 25, 1938, as the triumphant dawn of the American middle class. But the hidden mechanics of its passage reveal a far colder truth. The minimum wage was not a universal victory born of sudden national enlightenment. It was a compromise carved out through political expediency, constructed on the back of a deliberate racial carve-out that left millions of marginalized workers trapped in the very economic void the law was supposed to destroy. The master key had worked. The legislation had survived the legal gauntlet, bypassed the judicial blockade, and fundamentally altered the relationship between American capital and American labor. The public celebrated the 25-cent wage floor as a monumental progressive achievement, but behind the triumph lay an invisible machinery of exclusion, a structural flaw built directly into the foundation of the law that would echo through the American economy for generations to come. This investigation connects directly to the broader architecture of control we unravel across secret state files, where isolated historical decisions aggregate into the modern system governing our daily lives. The standard history books paint the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 as a crown triumph of American social policy, a benevolent gift that forever rescued the nation's working class from the nightmare of unbridled industrial servitude. But when you pull back the curtain of sanitized national myth and look at the immediate systemic aftermath, a far more cold and calculated picture comes into focus. The immediate result of establishing a mandatory 25-cent wage floor was not an instantaneous, uniform eradication of poverty. Instead, it triggered a massive, deliberate restructuring of the American labor market. In the immediate months following June 1938, corporate industrial networks across the South began systematically mechanizing operations or simply firing hundreds of thousands of workers who were deemed unprofitable at 25 cents an hour. Because the law explicitly excluded agricultural and domestic workers, the two primary sectors employing black, Hispanic, and rural laborers, the structural inequality was not solved. It was legally entrenched. Consider the cold economic reality of that racial carve-out. By cutting farmhands and maid service out of federal protections, the law effectively created a multi-tiered labor system. Millions of minority workers were left trapped in a legal vacuum where employers could still legally pay pennies a day, keeping an entire demographic frozen in near-feudal dependency. What was celebrated as a milestone of progressive enlightenment was, in practice, a selective economic wall that protected urban, industrial, predominantly white workers while leaving the nation's most vulnerable labor force completely exposed to unmitigated exploitation. And this pattern of systemic expansion and selective exclusion did not stop in 1938. Over the decades that followed, the federal minimum wage was slowly expanded to cover more industries, but the structural mechanism of control remained identical. Every single time workers mobilized to demand higher pay or safer conditions, corporate interests adapted, finding new legal backdoors and legislative exemptions to bypass the statutory baseline. It is documented that for nearly 70 years, periodic adjustments by Congress kept the federal wage floor roughly aligned with rising productivity and inflation. It is documented that during the mid-20th century, the minimum wage helped fuel the expansion of the post-war American middle class. But what remains deeply calculated is how that mechanism was quietly allowed to freeze in place. Here is the pattern reveal moment. Step back and look at the blueprint that has repeated itself across every major institution in modern American history. First comes a deep systemic crisis, followed by public outrage. Then an unelected or appointed architect steps into the vacuum to draft a regulatory fix. Next, that fix is implemented with hidden carve-outs that protect elite interests. And finally, the system metastasizes until the regulatory baseline becomes a ceiling that traps the very people it was designed to lift up. Look at where that blueprint has brought us today. The federal minimum wage was last raised by Congress in July 2009, setting the baseline at $7.25 an hour. Since that day, the American economy has weathered massive inflation cycles, explosive housing costs, skyrocketing healthcare expenses, and unprecedented corporate profitability. Yet, for over 15 years, the federal wage floor has remained entirely frozen, marking the longest period without a minimum wage increase in the entire history of the United States. Think about what that stagnation actually represents. In real economic value, a wage of $7.25 today buys drastically less than the original 25 cents an hour did back in 1938. The statutory protection designed to guarantee a basic human baseline of living has been quietly eroded by time, legislation, and political paralysis. At the exact same time, major modern corporations have revived the century-old legal argument of liberty of contract under a slick, modernized corporate title, the gig economy. By classifying millions of rideshare drivers, delivery workers, and digital laborers as independent contractors rather than traditional employees, tech conglomerates have successfully bypassed the Fair Labor Standards Act entirely. Once again, workers are told they possess the freedom to accept pennies on the dollar, operating without guaranteed minimum pay, overtime protections, or basic health benefits. The ghost of the 1900s legal system has returned, stripped of its Gilded Age rhetoric and rebranded as digital flexibility. The corporate architecture built over a century ago to exploit child laborers and textile workers did not disappear when Frances Perkins signed a piece of paper in 1938. It simply evolved, adopting new technologies and legal disguises to preserve the exact same power dynamic. The cage was built over decades of bloody strikes, legislative betrayals, and supreme legal maneuvering. And as the real value of human labor continues to be squeezed by systemic stagnation and corporate evasions, the foundational question of the industrial era rises back to the surface, more urgent now than it has ever been. Now, return to that barefoot 7-year-old standing in the cotton dust, his hands grease-stained and bleeding, earning 12 cents for 14 hours of brutal labor. Look at what that image actually tells us about the world we inhabit right now. Every time you receive a paycheck, every time you see a job posting with a mandatory minimum salary, or every time you glance at the hourly rate displayed on a workplace poster, you are looking at the direct lineage of a decades-long struggle that nearly tore the United States apart. The statutory baseline of $7.25 an hour, frozen in place since July 2009, is not just an arbitrary economic number. It is the surviving artifact of a fierce historical conflict over who owns human time and how much an individual's life is legally worth. Sit with that haunting reality for a moment. For the first 162 years of American history, the concept of a legally enforced floor beneath human wages did not exist. It was not granted by benevolent corporate leaders, nor was it easily handed down by forward-thinking politicians. It was extracted, inch by inch, through 30 years of intense labor organizing, devastating industrial disasters, Supreme Court blockades, and the utter catastrophe of the Great Depression. And yet, when the floor was finally constructed in 1938, the architects built it with a deliberate structural flaw. By excluding millions of farm workers and domestic servants along racial lines, the system ensured that the most vulnerable workers remained trapped in the very void the law claimed to destroy. Today, as gig economy platforms resurrect the old legal logic of liberty of contract to classify workers as independent contractors without wage guarantees, that same structural void is quietly expanding once again. Now that you know who built the wage floor, who fought to destroy it, and who was deliberately left out, do you still see your paycheck the same way? I want to be very precise here about what the historical record actually establishes. Historians continue to debate whether the racial exclusions of the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act were a calculated political necessity to pass the bill through a segregated Congress or an intentional preservation of a racial caste system by the political elite. What remains beyond dispute is the structural result. Millions of Americans were denied the legal baseline of human dignity for generations, establishing economic disparities that persist to this very day. If you want to look past the sanitized history books and understand the invisible systems that govern your daily life, join us. Subscribe to Secret State Files, turn on notifications, and become part of a community that refuses to accept the official story. Leave a comment below, letting us know your thoughts on whether the federal wage floor should be indexed to inflation or if the system was engineered to fail from the start. In our next investigation, we will uncover the unelected bureaucrat who secretly transformed the American tax code into a permanent instrument of corporate surveillance. Stay tuned.